Good evening. Welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry, and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Hey, we're in the middle of a study of Matthew 16, 27 and 28, and we are demonstrating that Matthew 16, 27 and 28 did prophesy the second coming of Christ, and it was in fact fulfilled within the lifetime of Christ's first century disciples, just like he promised. Now, in order to demonstrate this, once again, I want to take a look at another theme that is present in both Matthew 16 and Daniel 7, its prophetic source, which is the time when the saints received the kingdom. And as we'll see, according to Matthew 25, which we'll get to, the saints received the kingdom at the second coming of Christ and the judgment of all men in AD 70. Let's go first to Daniel 7. Notice in Daniel 7, which again is the prophetic source for both Matthew 16 and Matthew 25, it says this in verses 21 through 22. And I kept looking, and that horn, that is the little horn of the fourth beast, was waging war with the saints and overpowering them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, and the time arrived that the saints took possession of the kingdom. That is a perfectly parallel prophecy to Matthew 16, 27, and 28. In both passages, we have three identical themes or elements. We have the coming of the Son of Man, we have the time of judgment, and we have the time of the establishment of the kingdom. That is when the saints take possession of the kingdom. Okay? But according to Matthew 25, the time when the saints take possession of the kingdom is at the second and final coming of Christ and the judgment of every man. That can only mean that Matthew 16, 27, and 28 and Daniel 7 as its prophetic source did prophesy the second coming of Christ, and according to Jesus, it must have been fulfilled in the lifetime of his disciples. In order to prove this very, very powerfully, go with me to Matthew 16 and Matthew 25. I'm going to do it once again, a comparative study, which I will upload in PDF on my website. But I want you to see the perfect parallels between Matthew 16, 27, and 28 and Matthew 25, 31 through 34. And we'll identify the coming of the Son of Man and the time when the saints take possession of the kingdom of Matthew 16 as the second coming of Christ in AD 70, according to Matthew 25. Now watch this. In both passages, and you know what? Let me just read the text first, and then we'll get into this parallel, okay? Because I want you to really catch this. Matthew 16, watch this. Verses 27 and 28 says this. For the Son of Man is going to come, that's the coming of the Lord, in the glory of his Father, that's glory, with his angels, okay? Will then repay every man according to his deeds. That's judgment. Truly I say to you, verse 28, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Did you catch all the elements? The coming of the Son of Man in glory with his angels in the context of judgment and to establish the kingdom. Those elements are exactly what we find in Matthew chapter 25, 31 through 34. Watch this. But when the Son of Man comes, that's the coming of the Son of Man in his glory, that is the glory of the Father, and all his angels with him. That's with his angels, Matthew 25, 31. He will sit on his glorious throne, and the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. The nations gathered before him is identical to the judgment of every man according to their works. This is the concept of judgment in Matthew 25. And look, notice in verse 33, he will put the sheep on his right, and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. That is the establishment of the kingdom. That is the time when the saints take possession of the kingdom in fulfillment of Daniel 7 and Matthew 16. All those elements are identical in both Matthew 16 and Matthew 25. Let me just say them once again for emphasis' sake. In both prophecies, we have the coming of the Son of Man in glory with the angels in the context of judgment according to their works, of the judgment of every man, all nations, in the context of the establishment of the kingdom, and it is the time when the saints receive the kingdom. What does that mean? Well, number one, almost all futurists admit that Matthew 25, 31 is the final eschatological second coming of Christ. But according to our parallels and according to the analogy of faith, by interpreting Scripture with Scripture, Matthew 25, 31 and following would be in fulfillment of Matthew 16, 27 and 28, and Daniel chapter 7. They are parallel prophecies, which means the coming of the Son of Man in his kingdom, in the glory of his Father with his angels, to reward every man according to his works in Matthew 16, 27 and 28, was prophetic of the second coming of Christ and the judgment of men at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, in Jesus' generation. Verily I say unto you, some of you who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That is powerful evidence of the first century second coming of Christ in fulfillment of Daniel 7, Matthew 16, and Matthew 25. And we'll see you next time. We'll have more on the time when the saints receive the kingdom next time on Answers on Eschatology. God bless and bye for now.